legal roundtable. For this one, we're going to focus on the adaptation of international and domestic law to innovative solutions. This panel will look at current and new possibilities in law around the world. It will also zoom in on some more concrete examples in countries like the Seychelles or Uruguay. So to moderate this panel, we're going to welcome back Andrew Heinrich, as well as the panelists, Romani Webb, Deputy Director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University, Liam Weber, Grant Manager of the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, and Carlos Mata, Doctor of Law and Social Sciences, University of the Eastern Republic of Uruguay. Would you welcome them now with me?
So, yeah, of course. Liam in the middle, and then Carlos here. Wonderful. Wonderful. And your mics are on your chairs. You have a microphone as well. Yeah, right there. Wonderful. Well, welcome back, everybody. Good afternoon. We've saved three of the best for last. My name is Andrew Heinrich. It's been a pleasure to get to know so many of you, and I will turn it right over to the panelists. Our goal this afternoon is to discuss innovative approaches in domestic and international law to the scientific innovations that we've spent all week talking about. So I really look forward to getting all of your perspectives, diverse set of perspectives here. Just a word on format. I'll let each panelist introduce themselves. I have some questions prepared to motivate discussions one-on-one with each of you. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion as a group, and then we'll take your questions at the end. So Carlos, let's start with you. So I have a clicker here for your slides to introduce yourself. So why don't you please start by introducing yourself and a little bit about what you've worked on behalf of Uruguay in this area.
Okay.
Oh, microphone. Yeah. It's on, I think.
Okay.
Your slides are up.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Read my...
As you prefer, yeah.
Okay.
As you prefer, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Henry. And first and of all, I would like to express my gratitude for the great honor of being invited to participate in this ocean conservation legal roundtable. The topic of this roundtable necessarily leads us to link it in a first approach to the relationship between international law and domestic law. Given the short time we have beyond monism and dualism, is a topic is the international law. Probably today is not studied because it's in issue the past. Past is very relationship when this topic of this round table. But in contemporary law, the interdependence between the two legal systems, international and domestic, is such that this debate are pointless. Regarding the second point of the topic, that is to say the hierarchy of regulation from both systems. We should make a distinction between self-executing regulation and those international regulations that possess such quality, and which court has jurisdiction over the matter, that is to say, wherever is an international or domestic arbitration court. Still, ever in the later case, it could be said that currently there is a certain primacy of international law over domestic law. Having said that, it should be noted that contemporary international law faces new challenges. In addition to the topic of this roundtable, such as fragmentation, informalization, and legal pluralism. The fragmentation of international law becomes a controversial issue when several institutions approach a problem differently and then is not clear consensus or common interpretative practice. The informalization of international law is increasing with the proliferation of soft law forms and solutions to dispute using technical or economical criteria. Finally, the reaffirmation of legal pluralism as a reflection of the diversity of the international field. In short, it is the context that we must locate the adaptation of international law and domestic law to innovative solutions. To do so, I will focus on an example, such as the emergence of environmental aspects in the law of the sea. In the development and evolution of the law of the sea, there are different elements involved. One of them is the emergence of environmental conservation and its impact on contemporary international law, as well as on national law, which also they do not modify its structure of different maritime space, still require a new perspective of them. I will briefly mention one of the different legal instruments with the content such as the Intergovernmental Conference on International Legally Binding Instrument under the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. In this regard, it should be considered that this legal instrument is part of the framework of the Convention of the Law of the Sea. Nevertheless, its amplest development that will have a significant impact of the paradigm of ocean governance. To date, 5 sessions have been held out of the 4 original establishments, and the last session, the continuation of the 5, was held from February 20 to March 4, 2023. In this last session, an agreement was reached of the treaty text, the creation of the working group for the technical review of the text, the publication of the text in the 6th language of the United Nations to proceed subsequently to adoption of the text by the Assembly, initially in June 2023. It is worth noting that both state parties to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea and non-part states participate in this conference, with a high level of participation from all members of the United Nations in attendance during several sessions. The high level of participation in the conference should be higher because once of the text is approved, it will have a generative effect on future customary regulation regard of the effective entry to force of the treaty and eventually as a soft law regulation. The instrument project is characterized by the ambition of its objective, judging by the section around which is structured and is comprehensive. Amongst them, regulate general provision, terms use, general objective, application, relationship with the other instruments, regulation, marine genetic research, including huge relate of the benefits sharing, regulate geographical bus management mechanisms, including marine protected areas and other measures, regulates environmental impacts assessment, capacity building and marine technology transfer, regulate institutional agreement, regulate financial resource of financing mechanisms, regulate implementance and compliance, and regulate dispute settlement. It's a very long treaty, an important treaty, because this treaty is changed the paradigm of the Convention of the Law on the Sea and the governments on the oceans. In this, if the project structure is analyzed within the legal logic of the Convention on the Law of the Sea, it can be appreciated that in spatial scope refers especially to the high seas, where it is intended to establish a new paradigm in many respects, with an important emphasis on the legal regime in this maritime zone. In addition to the above, the report of the Secretary General of the United Nations on the Oceans and the Law of the Sea, the resolution of the Assemblea of the States Party to the Convention of the Law of the Sea, and other organs created by the Convention. This is, in turn, demonstrative the dynamism and current relevance on this area of international law, which must necessarily be assumed a challenge to be taken into consideration by national states when developing their public policy on the different marine areas.
Thank you, Carlos.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
My presentation.
And to bring Liam into the conversation, how about you introduce yourself now and tell us a little bit about your work and your very, very innovative work at SECAT. Sure, please. And if you'd want for your slides.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liam Weber. I'm the grants manager at the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust. It's quite a mouthful, so we just say SECAT. I'd just like to special thanks to Andrew and to Romain for your kind hospitality and to distinguished guests. I'd also like to echo the words from Dr. Wildcat that we are all related, we're brothers and sisters, and being here is a great honor for me. So just a little bit about the organization I work for. And to put it into a bit of context, so Seychelles is a small island nation. There's a population of about 100,000 people, and it's a massive EEZ of 1.4 million square kilometers. And our land is actually 450 square kilometers, so you can see the extent of our EEZ. We're a biodiversity hotspot. We have marine mammal corridors. We have many corals and fish species and seabird breeding grounds. And as you can see on the fourth graphic, with the 60% of our GDP is reliant on fisheries and tourism. So it's an extremely important sector for us, and that's how we do as much as we can to kind of protect and promote conservation and economical use in this area. So this is just a little bit of background about SECAT. I'll whiz through these. I know Andrew has a bunch of questions lined up for me, but basically SECAT was developed on the back of the Marine Spatial Plan and the protection of 30% of Seychelles' EEZ. It's independent and public and private. So it was set up with the debt for nature swap in mind, which we'll get into a little bit later, and as well as the blue bonds. And this is quite an interesting graphic. So this is the way SECAT was financed and the financing mechanisms that go through SECAT. So you can see the top row, and that's specifically the debt for nature swap, whereas this column next to me was the blue bonds. So that's pretty much the way SECAT is capitalized, and you can see the movement of the funds through SECAT. And kind of, yeah, I know it's quite a lot to process, but maybe if you'd like more information, feel free to contact me, and I'll be able to send through this to you. I'm sure some of you might have heard about the sovereign blue bond. It's the world first in Seychelles. And this is a little bit about the model, about how it operates. And I know Andrew has a couple more questions on these. But basically, it's $15 million. $3 million go out in the form of grants to enabling the Marine Spatial Plan, to the Blue Economy, to marine protected areas, whereas $12 million is investment fund that's managed by the Development Bank of Seychelles, and that's for loans for the enhancement of the Blue Economy. And as I mentioned, the grants, so these are the five sections that fall under the Blue Grants Fund. So it's the marine protected areas, fisheries sector, rehabilitation of coastal environments, climate adaptation, and blue economy. These are just examples. I won't get into them. I know we're a bit pressed for time, but feel free to visit our website. It's seycat.org, and all these examples are posted on there. This we'll get into a little bit later as well, but this is the nationally determined contribution and the 30 by 30 goal, essentially. And I think there was one more slide. Anyway, there isn't apparently. Yeah, so just again, thank you again, Andrew and Rome and distinguished guests for having SECAT here. We're honored to be here and share the knowledge that we've developed over the last few years.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Liam. And I might, if it's okay with you, if you want to join us again, I might just jump into one or two of the questions I had for you. You're right that your debt exchange is really a fascinating approach. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating is that you're exchanging debt relief for, among other things, policy commitments in areas of protection. So I'd love to, maybe if you could give us an example of one of those policy commitments that you've exchanged for, and does SECAT take a hand in drafting or designing those policy commitments that it exchanges for debt relief?
Yeah, thanks. Andrew, is it on? Perfect. So a lot of the commitments that you've mentioned, and I'll just touch on a few of them briefly, but one of them was the Convention of Biological Diversity at Rio Plus 20 in 2012. And our former president, Danny Fall, committed to the 30% protection of Seychelles' EEZ. This was already in 2012. So this was 8 years prior to the 2020 CBD, where a lot more of the parties got on board. So it kind of shows that when there's political will, things can get done in those kind of ways. And some other commitments that Seychelles has made is the Abu Dhabi Blue Economy Summit, where we committed to developing a blue economy. And off the back of that, we've actually developed the Department of Blue Economy within Seychelles, and that falls under the ministry, its own ministry, tied quite closely to fisheries, actually. And the third commitment we had was the nationally determined contribution in 2021. And this was the protection of blue carbon ecosystems. And for those of you who don't know, that's seagrass, mangroves, and tidal flats and salt marshes. And by 2025, we're committed to protecting 50%, and by 2030, we're committed to protecting 100%. But the president last year, President Seychelles last year, committed to protecting 100% of blue carbon ecosystems by this year.
Wow.
So we're well ahead and on track and in those regards. And regarding SECAT's involvement, a lot of these commitments were made on the back of SECAT being the managing and the vehicle for a lot of these. So SECAT's been quite instrumental in a lot of these commitments, and quite frankly, the resources would not have been given to the government of Seychelles if it wasn't for almost like a middleman organization that can build international trust with a lot of these international donors to get the funding and mobilize them in these ways.
Fantastic. And one final piece, if I may, for you before we head over to Romani for her initial introduction, is the government's blue bonds are a really essential part of this puzzle. So could you kind of define your terms for us? Tell us a little bit about these blue bonds and how they work.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, speaking to some of my fellow colleagues around here and distinguished guests, the blue bond seems to be quite internationally known, especially because it's the world's first sovereign blue bond. So the blue bond works in a very similar way to traditional bonds, except the issuing entity commits to using those resources for marine protection and blue economy and conservation. So as I mentioned, $15 million with a guarantee from the World Bank of $5 million was given to Seychelles in the form of blue bond. $12 million goes to the Development Bank of Seychelles to give out in blue economy loans, whereas $3 million is given to SECAT to manage, where we disperse them at $500,000 a year in form of grants. And these grants fulfill those strategic objectives I mentioned earlier, but all to do with the marine protection, enabling the marine spatial plan, the blue economy, all the type of stuff that an island nation like Seychelles with the vast EEZ can only benefit from.
Incredible. Really incredible and innovative work. And you're right, the blue bonds have been talked about quite a bit over the course of the week. So, Romani, I'd love to hear a little bit about the Sabin Center and some of the work that you do in studying the law and policy around various carbon dioxide removal technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks to the Foundation for having me here today. It's really great to be with you. As was said, I'm the Deputy Director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, which is an academic think tank housed at Columbia Law School in New York City. Our mission is to develop innovative legal tools to address climate change and to advance climate justice. So we believe that the law has a really central role to play in catalyzing action on climate change, in sort of driving those changes in government, corporate, and individual behavior, and in managing the transition that goes along with that to make sure it occurs in a fair and equitable and just way. So we work both domestically in the United States and internationally, and our work takes a number of different forms. We have a number of online resources that are, I would say, complementary to the Climate Policy Radar tool that we just heard about. The goal of those online resources is really to track, describe, and analyze key developments in climate law. So we have, for example, a USN global climate litigation database that includes about 3,000 court cases in which climate law, policy, or science issues have been raised. We also have a lot of databases that are focused on tracking developments specifically in US climate law. So just a couple of weeks ago, for example, we launched what we're calling the Inflation Reduction Act tracker that sort of monitors federal government actions to implement the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by Congress at the end of last year. I'm sure you've all heard of it. It's really the most important climate law ever passed in the United States, includes almost $400 billion in government funding for climate mitigation and adaptation, has the potential to be truly transformative, but only if it's implemented effectively. And so we're tracking that implementation. Like the Climate Policy Radar folks, we see this as a really important way of enhancing accountability and also equipping climate activists and giving them the information they need to participate and inform sort of climate law and policy development. The other way we do that is through our research work, which spans a variety of topics in the climate space: climate mitigation, adaptation, climate justice, climate finance, energy transition, a whole lot more. I'll just say a couple of words about our work on climate and the ocean. I'm sure this audience already knows, but it bears repeating just the extent of really devastating impacts of climate change on the ocean. We have an ocean acidification crisis. We are seeing declining oxygen levels in the ocean, warming of the oceans, all of which are having these really serious negative impacts on ocean ecosystems. At the same time, though, the ocean can be an important source of climate solutions. And we're seeing in the United States and in many other places this sort of push to develop offshore renewable energy, primarily offshore wind, which is really important to help reduce our carbon dioxide emissions and to mitigate climate change. But that is not enough by itself to mitigate climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others have said that we also need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The IPCC has actually described carbon dioxide removal as unavoidable if we want to stay within the temperature goals set in the Paris Agreement. And here again, the ocean can be really helpful. There's a variety of techniques that have been proposed that would enhance the ocean's ability to absorb and store carbon dioxide. They're all at fairly new stages of development, early stages of development, and there is a need for a lot more research. We're seeing a lot of investment in research. We're also seeing a huge amount of private sector interest in this field. In the US, over the last sort of 2 years or so, we've seen this proliferation of startups that are looking to commercialize ocean carbon removal and carbon storage techniques. So it's sort of on the cusp of a new industry, and it's really important that we have in place legal structures that can support that industry, enable it to grow and develop, but may ensure that that growth and development happens in a safe and responsible way. And so we at the Sabin Centre have been doing a lot of work on sort of what that legal framework should look like. We started out by sort of tracking how different ocean carbon dioxide removal techniques are treated under existing law, both at the international level and then also domestically in various countries. So far we've looked at 7 countries across North America, Europe and Asia. And what we found when we did that analysis is that there's a number of gaps and shortcomings in existing legal frameworks that mean that they're not particularly well suited to regulating this sort of new activities in the ocean. And so we really need a new legal framework for that. So we've been working to develop and advance legal reforms that can create a framework that is supportive of these activities so that we can do the research we need to sort of figure out how and where they can be used to address climate change, but also make sure that that research occurs in a scientifically sound way that doesn't present undue risks to the environment or to communities.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And you've touched on kind of the existential dilemma of lawyers and policymakers. Whenever there's an emerging technology or an emerging concept like a new bond issuance, the question is, can we sufficiently adapt existing laws to meet the new reality, or do we need a new framework? So I'd love to take those 2 issues in hand. First, the adaptation of existing frameworks, and then the developing of new frameworks. So to you, Romany, you know, we've talked about this, that some of the carbon dioxide removal technologies that are being developed kind of rub up against existing legal frameworks, and existing legal frameworks at that didn't envision these sorts of technologies being developed. And we've talked, for example, about ocean alkalinity and how some of the conventions that might rub up against in ways that might prohibit the technology from being used as effectively as it can be. So before we go into the evolution of the new, let's focus on kind of the potential for adaptation of the existing. And when you see a gap that exists, or you see something that is maladjusted for the new reality, what do you think about in terms of ways you might be able to make the science and policy meet somewhere in the middle, that there might be a way to at least get this off the ground in the absence of a completely new framework?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of international agreements, international ocean agreements and international environmental agreements that are relevant to these activities and can help provide guidance on how these activities can be pursued in the ocean in a safe way. I think the challenge that we've seen is that as we've tried to sort of fit these new activities into these existing legal frameworks, we've seen this real disconnect between the approach that's been taken in, say, the global climate regime, which is generally speaking very supportive of these activities, you know, has issued decisions and resolutions that are trying to push these activities forward. And then in other contexts, in, say, the global ocean regime, we've seen a number of decisions and resolutions being adopted that are very restrictive. You know, for example, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, the parties have adopted a series of resolutions dealing with particular types of ocean carbon dioxide removal that basically say those activities should not take place. They do include carve-outs for research, but they're really narrow. So for example, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity have said we should only allow small-scale research projects that can be conducted in a controlled setting. When you're talking about activities in the ocean, there's really no controlled setting unless you're doing it sort of in a mesocosm setting. So that's actually a de facto sort of ban on these activities. I think that it's important when we're thinking about how we can adapt these existing frameworks to better facilitate these activities. I do think it's really important that we try to bridge that gap between what we see in the climate regime and what we see in the global ocean governance regime and the global sort of environmental regime, and try to bring those 2 worlds together, because the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. You know, the climate regime is probably a little over-optimistic about the role these activities can play, and the ocean regime is probably too pessimistic. So bringing those 2 together, I think, would be really sort of valuable.
Great, excellent. And Carlos, if I could go back to you, because you bring the perspective of someone who in government has worked on negotiating some of these treaties on behalf of Uruguay. How do you think about industry and its advancements as you are in the negotiating room working with foreign governments to come to an agreement on a treaty? Are you thinking about technologies and realities that exist while you're negotiating? Kind of the status quo, you take a picture and that's what you bring into the room? Or are you thinking a little bit into the future of what realities might evolve?
It's very interesting, your question, but the answer is not easy. Because I think the framework, the international law, is very important for all, not only the states, it's all the world, the persons, finally the persons. And the international law is important, very important, for the balance the different interests, private interests and state interests. And in the negotiation in the United Nations, in the Convention on the Law on the Sea and BB&J, is not easy. It's very complicated because the balance for me is the more important. And the new technology probably not always is new. It's different. But the consequence in the ocean is similar to the old technology. And the international law needs necessarily the scientific conclusion, but this balance is correctly. And the science probably not advance in very quickly with the negotiation. And this is a big problem in the negotiation. But I think it's not the controversy entre private and state. Repeat, for me, the international law, the end, finally, is the person. It's not the private or the state. And this discuss is not easy. It's not easy. But for the state is important the framework. The framework because it's a guarantee for all the people, and all the state and all the enterprise.
Interesting. And Liam, I think the framework being something that potentially existed in fragments is very true of what you've done in the Seychelles. Private-public partnerships exist in some formats, but maybe not quite how SECAT and the Seychelles have worked together. Debt financing instruments with some sort of conditionality have existed in the past, but probably not like blue bonds or anything like that. So we've had environmental conditionalities in, say, bilateral investment treaties, but again, not really in debt instruments. And so there were pieces of doctrine in different areas of the law that probably, if you kind of had your puzzle pieces and could fit them together, SECAT works, but it probably hadn't been put together quite that way before. So tell us a little bit about that thought process, and we talked a little bit about this at lunch, but about maybe some of the remaining gaps that exist that might need to be addressed moving forward.
So as you know, the debt for nature swaps isn't a new concept, right? It's been around for quite a long time, but what makes Seychelles and SECAT quite innovative is that it's the first debt for nature swap with marine conservation in mind, right? And that's a world first. So it's taking, as you said, like knowledge and things from other parts of the world and adapting it to what works in Seychelles and what fits in Seychelles. And but as you mentioned, the gaps, there's plenty of gaps still identified, right? And under the Marine Spatial Plan in Seychelles, which has garnered a lot of international attention, we get a lot of international NGOs approaching SECAT because we're the financing vehicle for all of the MSP work in Seychelles. And they've come to us in close collaboration with the Nature Conservancy, in close collaboration with SECAT. We've identified a lot of these gaps. And a lot of them might have been legal gaps. There might have been implementation gaps. And for example, although the SMS, the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan, the MSP, was identified and conceptualized, there was no operational vehicle for it, a coordination unit. So a gap that was identified was with the Blue Nature Alliance, and they came to SECAT and with the TNC, and they said, okay, how are we going to make sure this MSP runs? And one of the ways throughout these discussions, it came out that the MSP needed something like an authority to manage the MSP and all the MPAs within it. And off the back of that, we've established the Seychelles Oceans Authority, which is later in the year going to be written into law and have its own act, and that's going to pretty much be the coordination and management unit for the entire MSP within Seychelles. But these gaps kind of apply. Sorry, up here. So, yeah, but these gaps can only be identified and filled with close communication and collaboration with all stakeholders. You know, this isn't a top-down approach. This isn't something we're forcing on it, but really communicating and having transparency with all stakeholders across all different levels.
That's great. And if I can stay on you for the stakeholders point for a moment, because I think it really connects to our panel from this morning about indigenous expertise. As I mentioned to you leading up to this, one of the stories from SECAT that really grabbed my attention was the group of fishermen who voluntarily closed a trap fishery and are now working to get this codified in law. So it's not only is it ground up in the sense that they called for the reform, but actually they carried out the policy themselves and then want it codified. Have you seen other examples like this where the general public are kind of driving the lawmaking for you and for the government? And what potential do you see for grassroots efforts like this that maybe haven't been discussed as much, but for the panel this morning, as taking a centerpiece in the solutions moving forward?
Yeah, so in Seychelles specifically, bottom-up approaches are quite successful. And using those grassroots and the traditional knowledge of a lot of the first peoples within Seychelles. And just to touch on that, the fishers that closed that trap fishery, they identified that, I mean, fishers experience the effects of overfishing more than anyone else. So it came from them that's, okay, let's close this bay for 6 months and fish in the other fishing grounds. And then once this bay opens up, then there'll be more resources for those 6 months. And what they found was a 6 centimeter average growth amongst the two species. Wow. And that was from there. That was from one of the first grants that SECAT gave out in the first cycle was to fund that activity, but it came from them. And another example is there's a big fly fishing industry in Seychelles. And a catch and release has always been associated with that industry, but there was no data to indicate whether the catch and release was successful, whether the fish had a post-release mortality and things like that. So the fishers in that community said, okay, let's study this. And they approached SECAT, and then they got given the grant, and they did a whole study on the giant tree valleys. So. And now giant tree valleys on the outer islands are completely protected. You're not allowed to kill them, only catch and release. And so a lot of these bottom-up grassroots approaches that are more efficient in a way of getting through, especially in a small island nation like Seychelles, where the path to the top and the path to policy making are a lot shorter, although just as complicated and it's not easy as Carlos was mentioning, but it's almost more efficient to listen to the voices of the people and then go from that way rather than a top-down approach.
Yeah. Well, and connects a lot to the citizen scientist concept that we've heard a lot from quite a few panelists today, that it sounds like there was great research, as it were, being put out by this local community of fishermen that we probably all could learn from. So I think that's fantastic. One of the things I want to touch on eventually with you is the Marine Spatial Plan and its origins and its innovation. But to start with innovation, I want to go back to Romani, who I know calls for a new robust international law framework to handle carbon dioxide removal, and be it the artificial upswelling and the shortcomings you just mentioned with the Convention on Biological Diversity, or as I mentioned earlier, ocean alkalinity and issues under the London Convention. It seems that working within the model of current conventions just isn't going to work if we want these technologies to carry out the vision that we have for them. So my question to you is, where do you start, and how do you avoid the lack of future proofing that you just build something new to adapt to the new models of the day, but then 10 years from now we have some other new set of technologies and we have to do it all over again?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's always a challenge, right, between being so general as to be almost meaningless and so specific as to sort of limit your application. But I do think there's some sort of general broad-ish principles that are useful here that we can draw from existing international law and domestic law in various places. So, you know, to follow on Liam's point, community engagement in this space is hugely important. You know, there's been so many social science studies that have been done that have showed that people have a really unique relationship to the ocean. Even people who live far inland and very rarely visit the ocean or see it feel very connected to it and want to see it protected. There was a study recently in the United States that where I think 97% of people surveyed said that they wanted more marine protected areas where human activities were restricted because they saw human activities as having this devastating impact on the environment, on the ocean. So it's really important that whatever legal framework we create builds in robust community engagement, particularly, you know, building on tribal and indigenous knowledge. Ideally, you know, these projects should be co-designed with local communities. There's principles around environmental impact assessment that was talked about on one of the earlier panels. It's really important to have robust environmental impact assessment when we're thinking about moving ahead with these projects that could have significant benefits but also do present risks. Particularly for these activities that are, you know, really, in a way, scientific experiments, issues around monitoring and transparency should be at the front and center. You know, we need to be sort of monitoring and measuring not only the carbon and climate impacts of these activities, but also their broader environmental and community impacts, and we need to be making sure that that data is available. So they're sort of all elements that I would like to see in a new legal framework. The last thing that I'll just quickly mention is that, you know, in climate circles, there is a lot of concern about the potential for carbon removal to create what's called a moral hazard. The thinking being that, you know, if we have, if carbon removal is available, then that discourages people from reducing emissions. Of course, that's not what we want to see. We need to do both. And so it's important when we're thinking about designing a new legal framework for these activities that we do so in a way that avoids or at least discourages that sort of moral hazard. And there's been a lot of discussion about this in climate policy circles, you know, different things that you can do to reduce that risk, such as requiring countries or corporations to set separate targets and separately report on emissions reductions versus removals. But it's a really important issue that I think needs to be considered as we're thinking about crafting a framework for these activities.
Great, great. And Liam, to come back to you for innovation, I'll borrow with an example from US law for a moment. A former US Supreme Court justice once said that the beauty of the US federal system, where there's some independence for each of the 50 states to make their own laws, is that each state can be its own laboratory, where you can experiment with policies on a state level, and if they work, perhaps they can be rolled out on the federal level across the United States. And in some ways, perhaps you see the Marine Spatial Plan in the Seychelles as a sort of laboratory for other states, or may aspire for it to be such. So I'd love to hear a little bit about its origins and how your perspective of the Seychelles as kind of the laboratory for this new and innovative policy tool might be playing out with other island states.
Yeah, so first and foremost, SECAD is always open, willing, and transparent enough to share its knowledge and lessons learned across any countries, particularly the Western Indian Ocean, where we're based. So with regard to the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan, so that was quite an interesting one, because that was the reason SECAD was set up as a vehicle for all of this. And what we found, I mean, we have a vast EEZ. What we found was adopting a tiered approach would be best, and that would be, so we separated the EEZ into 3 different zones: Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3. So Zone 1 would be the highest biodiversity protection. That's your typical marine protected area. No take, no extraction, no seabed alteration at all. Sorry if I'm talking very fast. I'm trying to get through some time here. The second one is a sustainable use, and that's a 15% protection within the EEZ of. So you're allowed fishing, you're allowed certain activities, but with strict conditions, you know, and compliance with Fisheries Act, compliance with the Marine Spatial Plan law, etc. And so with Zone 1 and Zone 2, that covers the 30% protection. So we've already achieved the goal of 30 by 30. And we're 7 years ahead, you know, and that's because of the tiered approach that we've done. And Zone 3 is the multiple use, maximizing blue economy and building it, but in a sustainable way within to make the livelihoods of these fishes to not impact them necessarily as much, and also to keep developing the blue economy within Seychelles. And the last thing, or just to touch on the gap that we mentioned a little bit earlier, is the gap is within implementation, because Seychelles does not have the capacity in the workforce to implement a 400,000 square kilometer protected EEZ. So how do we finance that? How do we find who's going to be policing? Where do we get the workforce from? Where do we get the financing from? All these kind of questions that need to be identified. And it's in collaboration with a lot of our partners, our international donors, the government of Seychelles, and other interested parties. It's like almost like a round table, but for discussion of filling these gaps and things like that.
Really incredible, wonderful. With that, I definitely have more questions. I know I could go on all day, but I want to turn to all of you and see if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask our really distinguished panelists. Please. We should have a roaming mic somewhere.
Have a bearing on the broader oceans. And so where is liability in that? And I'm just quite interested in your view on that. And then, Liam, in terms of your coupon on your bond, how do you measure and value the impact and the payback? Because that's still a fairly inexact science. I'm really interested in. Are you being held to account for it?
Do you want to start with the second question first, maybe, Liam, and talk about?
Yeah, sure. So with regard to the blue bonds, it essentially is a loan, so we do have to pay it back. But it's paid back at a discounted rate, and it's paid back. So of the $12 million, that sits as a traditional bank loan. But the $3 million is in the form of grants. And it is always tricky to measure, like, what is the value of identifying the resources of a certain fish species, for example? What's the value of closing a trap fishery? And those discussions are regularly had. You know, it's more about if you can ensure long-term sustainability in a lot of these sectors, then it's almost invaluable in certain ways. So I think that's kind of the financial hit that the government of Seychelles takes, because realizing that the long-term impacts are going to be a lot outweigh that short-term financial loss that they may have.
And Romani, it feels like the first question was probably mostly for you, if you'd like to jump in. Yeah, Carlos as well, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and it's a real challenge, particularly, something we think a lot about in the ocean carbon dioxide removal space, because for a lot of the carbon removal techniques, we're talking about adding stuff to the ocean. So, you've probably all heard about ocean fertilization, where you're adding iron or other nutrients to the ocean to stimulate phytoplankton growth. There's alkalinity approaches that involve adding ground rock. The United States could permit a project in the EEZ that involves the addition of nitrogen, and that could easily spread into the high seas. We don't currently have a good mechanism, I would argue, for managing that. The BB&J goes some way towards doing that, but the challenge is in the implementation, and the enforcement, I think, is particularly challenging. Historically, we've sort of, a lot of people have said, well, the flag state of the vessel you're using will be responsible for enforcing that law. But does that actually happen, in practice? The practicalities, I think, are even more challenging than to some extent, more challenging than the legal questions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think it's a very important question, because in my generation, the relationship, the international law and domestic law, I think is the past issue. but now is the past issue. For the small country, it's important this situation because the framework is equity for the states is necessary a international law, but the traditional international law, because today the soft law is the more important norms in the international law. And this situation is not correctly or is not good. Why? Because this situation is not equity for the small countries. I need an international law in treaties, in customs, in general principle. It's necessary this situation for clarify the international law and relationship between states. And in the ocean, clearly in the ocean. The situation, the ocean, between the national jurisdiction is the big problem, is the problem today in the ocean. Why? Because the norms is not clearly or not exist norm, but the soft law is not the solution this question. It's necessary norms the international law. And I think the BBNJ is an important effort for the good relationship between the states. But I think this question is for a course of 1 year or 6 months for respond your question. But thank you for your question.
Sure, Liam, please.
Yeah, I just
please,
have a point to add on to that. As an example of the areas beyond national jurisdiction, so Seychelles and Mauritius have a joint management agreement of the Saya de Mala Bank, which is outside the national jurisdiction of both Seychelles and Mauritius EEZ. And that's an example, and of course there are issues with it, implementation problems with it, but that could be an example of Seychelles, Mauritius having identified a region outside its EEZ, beyond its national jurisdiction, that is of high biological importance and that needs adequate management and implementation on these measures, right? And this was before the BBNJ recently, so it requires collaboration with nearby nations that have identified these areas and nations that are willing to take on the ownership of these areas beyond national jurisdiction, not for financial gain, but for preservation and conservation of these biologically important areas.
Really interesting. Yeah, Uruguay and Argentina had tried something similar too with a shared EEZ. Absolutely. Other questions from the audience? Yeah, please. I think you might get more than one mic.
Thank you. Congratulations to the panel. I just have one comment to what Liam just said, because it's also important to highlight that the experience between Mauritius and Seychelles comes from the joint development agreement that both countries signed on the extended continental shelf even before the CLC has made its submission. So the impetus for cooperation, even in the intersection between the extended continental shelf and the water column of the high seas, has always been there. So that's why it made it easier for this step to be taken. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be a good model to learn from that, lessons learned and replicate in other places.
I think we had another question in the corner, yeah, and then in the back, yeah.
Mine is of the worst kind. It's a comment, not a question, and just goes back to Romani's first thing and something that I really wanted to say on stage, so I'm taking opportunity of having the mic. The Sabin Center's litigation resources, which are phenomenal, are not just going to be complementary to climate policy. We're actually going to collaborate, so all of our tools will be available using their databases. So we'll see all of those capabilities on climate litigation. Not really for the panel, but just saying that.
Wonderful, wonderful. No, so great to see those two amazing organizations working together. I think we had a question towards the back. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. This is a question for Dr. Mata. So you mentioned that the law needs to be applied at an individual level. Do you have a concrete example how Uruguay's domestic law is communicating the law to the individuals?
Okay, thank you for your question. If I understand correctly your question, Uruguay have an experience for the protected areas with the zona económica exclusiva is a common zone space of fishing in Uruguay with Argentina since 1974. It's a good experience, and I think this situation in the domestic law in in Paris, because it's an international law, this norm, because it's a treaty in Uruguay and Argentina, and this situation, finally, the end is for the person, the people, because the ocean in the jurisdiction, national jurisdiction, is better for the person. For the person, in this case, the Uruguayan and Argentinian people in this zone, and is important. And for this, my perspective in the international law is, if not only the international law, all the law finally is for the people. And is my opinion in this situation. And the ocean, probably or not probably, in the future, is a special area, not each state, if all the work, and needs a solution, juridical solution, for this special space, maritime space. But is not, probably in some time, in many years, is a new perspective of this maritime space. In Spanish, the alta mar is probably same to the zone in the space. The mar is a patrimonio común de la humanidad in Spanish. Is I think in 2, 4, 5 years is this the situation, this zone del alta mar in the future.
Fantastic, wonderful. Any other questions from the audience? If not, I'll close on one rapid fire question. Maybe we'll start with Carlos, we'll work towards the end. I like ending on optimistic notes. What progress in law as it relates to the oceans, broadly speaking, has you most optimistic in the moment, even if it's not maybe in your precise area of study or policy work? What has you most optimistic at the moment? Maybe we start on the other end then.
I'm happy to go first. Backfires in this instance. No, I think just earlier this week, on Tuesday this week, the Biden administration in the United States released an Ocean Climate Action Plan, which is really significant. Shows that the administration is really exploring the intersection of ocean and climate in a way that we haven't seen in the US before. I think it's a really could be a sort of first step towards a broader US engagement with the ocean, which I'm optimistic about.
Great. Liam?
My one would probably be more of a local example from Seychelles, and that's when the SMSP gets codified into law later this year. So it's been a long process, over 10 years, and we're nearly there. We just got to get over the hump. So probably that one's the most exciting. It looks like it will be codified into law, but then the steps of implementation and policing follow on after that. So it's an ongoing.
Great.
Thing, but yeah.
Great. Anything?
Okay, I'm very optimist in this case because I think all the treaty is important, but the climate change, the BBNJ, and others norms is important for the ocean. And I think in 2-3 years is application, this norm, not for treaty, custom or soft law.
Oh, yeah.
I think the tribunal, the international court, or the tribunal of maritime court is apply, the arbitration court apply this norm for soft law or custom.
Yeah, a great reminder for all my formalist friends back in the US that sometimes soft law and customary international law are where we find our best developments. Well, thank you very much to the three of you for your incredibly interesting interventions, and really, once again, thank you to everyone who participated in our discussion. I know I found it really enriching and learned a lot, so thank you once again, everybody.
Thank you so much, Andrew, to you. Thank you for that little note of optimism at the end. Thanks to our panel as well for that look at international and domestic law and innovative solutions. Well, that wraps it up for this first ever Ocean Conservation Legal Roundtable. Thank you so much for being part of it with us all. Of course, it was organized by the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation. I think we can give the organizers a big round of applause. Thank you to Olivier Romain and all their teams. Thank you to you for your attention, and have a wonderful evening. See you next year.
Thank you.